The 90-pound Belgian Malinois hit the ward at full sprint, claws skidding on linoleum, teeth out, a sound coming from his throat that wasn't barking. It was something older and more dangerous than that. 6 Navy SEALs scattered. A patient screamed. A crash cart went sideways into the wall. And in the middle of all of it, a 32-year-old civilian nurse dropped to one knee on the floor, looked the dog dead in the eyes, and said 2 words so quietly nobody else in the room could hear them. The dog stopped like he'd hit a wall. Then he walked to her and pressed his whole trembling body against her chest, like he was trying to disappear inside her. Before this story goes any further, if you're the kind of person who stays until the ending, who needs to know what really happened and who actually paid for it, hit subscribe right now. Ring that bell. And while you're watching, drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Because what happened inside Harwich Regional Medical Center on a Tuesday morning in October is the kind of thing that doesn't make the news, but it should. The morning shift at Harwich Regional Medical Center started the same way it always did, understaffed, undercaffeinated, and held together by a rotating cast of people who had long since stopped expecting things to go smoothly. Emily Carr arrived at 6:47, 13 minutes before her shift technically began, which put her squarely in the middle of the overnight crew's chaos. Someone had pulled the wrong IV line on a patient in room 14. A call button in the orthopedic wing had been going off for 20 minutes because the night nurse had forgotten to reset it. The coffee in the break room smelled like it had been there since the previous administration. Emily ignored the coffee, clocked in, grabbed the overnight report from the rack, and started reading while she walked. She was used to this. She had been used to it for 4 years, ever since she'd taken the civilian nursing position at Harwich after leaving the Army with an honorable discharge and a record that was technically spotless, if you didn't know where to look. Most people here didn't know where to look. Most people here didn't know much about her at all, which was exactly how she preferred it. She was 32, medium height, with the kind of posture that made people occasionally uncomfortable without knowing why. Too straight, too still, like someone who had learned a long time ago that moving carelessly got people killed. Her hair was dark blonde, and she kept it pulled back tight enough that it never moved. She had a small scar on her left forearm that she didn't explain when people asked, and a habit of scanning rooms when she entered them that her supervisor, Patricia Holden, had once described as slightly intense. Patricia meant it as a criticism. Emily didn't take it as one. She had just finished reviewing the overnight notes on the 3 patients in the military wing. The hospital had a formal agreement with the base at Fort Aldrin, 40 minutes north, to handle overflow medical cases that didn't require the full resources of the base hospital. When she heard the sound, it started as voices. Then it became something louder. She turned the corner into Corridor D and immediately understood what she was looking at. A military working dog, Belgian Malinois, somewhere north of 80 pounds, wearing a K9 vest with the Fort Aldrin emblem on the side, was at the far end of the hallway with his handler, a man in Navy fatigues who had clearly lost control of the situation about 45 seconds ago. The dog wasn't attacking anyone, not yet. But the way he was moving, low and fast, circling, teeth flashing, he was close. 2 orderlies had pressed themselves against the wall. A nurse Emily recognized from radiology was frozen in the middle of the hallway with both hands up like she was being robbed. And behind the handler were 5 more men, all built the same way, wide through the shoulders, watchful, the kind of men who made rooms feel smaller just by being in them. One of them had a hand on his sidearm, though he hadn't drawn it. He was watching the dog with an expression that was working very hard to look like it wasn't worried. Emily didn't hesitate. She walked forward. "Ma'am, please step back." She kept walking. "Ma'am, I need you to..." She went around the handler, stepped in front of the dog, dropped to one knee on the linoleum, and said 2 words in a flat, even voice. "Lantern out." The dog stopped. The sound he'd been making died instantly, like someone had hit a switch. His whole body changed, the tension in his haunches, the set of his jaw, the frantic energy that had been radiating off him in waves. He lowered his head. He walked toward her. He pressed himself against her chest and stood there trembling. Emily put one hand on the side of his neck. Not petting him, just holding. Steady pressure, steady contact. She felt the tremors moving through him and counted her own breathing deliberately. In, 4 counts, out 4 counts, until she felt him start to slow. The hallway was completely silent. Then the man with his hand on his sidearm said, "Who the hell is that?" His name was Marcus Vane. Commander, not chief. She would figure that out later. And he carried himself the way men carry themselves when they've spent years being the most capable person in every room they enter and have started to mistake that for something permanent. He was tall, maybe 6'2", somewhere in his late 30s, with the kind of face that had been handsome before it got weathered. His jaw was tight. His eyes were light brown, and right now they were fixed on Emily with an expression that she couldn't fully read yet. Part suspicion, part something else. Something older and harder. "She works here," the handler said. He looked rattled. His name tape read DeLuca. "She's one of the nurses." "I can see that." Vane took 3 steps forward. He stopped when the dog, Rook, Emily would learn in a moment, his name was right there on the vest, shifted his weight against her and lifted his lip in a silent warning, not directed at Emily, directed at Vane. Vane stopped. Emily looked up at him. She hadn't moved from her knee. "You want to tell me what he's doing in a patient care ward?" "I want to ask you," Vane said, "where you learned that phrase." "That's not an answer to my question." "No," he agreed. "It's not." He crouched down slowly until he was at something approximating her level. This close, she could see the exhaustion under the controlled surface. Not recent exhaustion, not a bad night's sleep. Something longer and more settled. "That phrase is classified." "Then whoever taught it to me had a security clearance," she said, "which means we can have this conversation with your CO present, or we can skip the part where you imply I'm a problem, and you can tell me what this dog is doing in my corridor without a muzzle." Something moved through Vane's expression that she couldn't name. "You're one of the nurses," he said again. Not a question this time, like he was processing something. "Emily Carr. I'm the charge nurse for this wing on the day shift." She stood up. Rook stayed pressed against her left leg. "Your dog has been limping since he came into this building, left rear, favoring it on turns. Before you take him anywhere, someone needs to look at that. He's been cleared by the base vet." "When?" Vane's jaw moved. 6 weeks ago." "Then he needs another look." "We have a visit scheduled." "I'm not talking about scheduled." She looked down at Rook, then back at Vane. "I'm talking about now, Bab." She found out his name from the duty roster, which she had no business looking at but which the overnight supervisor had left open on the desk near the nurse's station. Marcus Vane. She found the rest from context, from the way his men watched him, from the way he moved through the building when they brought Rook to the examination room they'd commandeered in the East Wing, from the way he looked at her every time he thought she wasn't paying attention. She was always paying attention. There were 6 of them total. The handler, DeLuca, who was clearly junior and clearly anxious. 2 other enlisted who stayed near the door and said nothing. A 4th man who appeared to be a medic. She recognized the indicators even out of uniform, the habit of watching physical spaces for exits, the specific kind of attention he paid to the IV stand in the corner. And a 5th man, older than the rest, who stood beside Vane and spoke to him occasionally in a voice too low for Emily to catch. His name tape read, Orban. Rook sat on the exam table and let Emily work. That was the thing that told her everything she needed to know about him. He'd been pushed to some edge in that hallway. Something had set him off that she hadn't seen, and he'd wound up teeth out in a corridor full of civilians. But here, with her hands moving over him in slow, deliberate passes, checking joints and muscle groups the way her combat medic training had taught her, he was entirely still. He trusted her. She didn't know why. She'd think about that later. "There," she said. She had her fingers on the ridge of muscle just below his left shoulder, where it met the joint, and she could feel it. Not swelling exactly, but the wrong kind of density. Tissue that had healed around something. "Feel this," she told DeLuca. He came over reluctantly and put his hand where she directed. "That's normal," he said. "He had an injury there, old wound." "How old?" 6 years. Maybe more." "That's not how healed tissue feels." She kept her hand where it was. "That's how tissue feels when it's working around something, accommodating something." She looked up at Vane, who was standing against the wall with his arms crossed. "He needs imaging, shoulder, full joint, deep tissue, if your base has the equipment." "Our vet cleared him? Your vet missed something." The silence that followed was the particular kind that had weight in it. Vane uncrossed his arms. "You're a civilian nurse." I'm a nurse with 8 years of Army medical training and 2 deployments, she said, keeping her voice flat. And your dog has been compensating for something in that shoulder for long enough that it's changed his gait pattern. You want to ignore that? That's your call. But when he goes down in the field because nobody wanted to listen to the civilian in the hallway, that's on you. Orban, the older man, said something to Vane too low for her to hear. Vane looked at her for a long moment. His expression was doing something complicated. 2 deployments, he said. That's what I said. Where? She met his eyes. Where were you, Commander? Another silence. This one different. He pulled out his phone and made a call. One. The base veterinarian's name was Dr. Hallie Morrow, and she arrived 40 minutes later with portable imaging equipment in a case that looked like it had been through 3 war zones, which it probably had. She was small, sharp-eyed, and she did not seem pleased to be there, though Emily couldn't tell if that was the early hour or something else. She did the imaging without commentary while Emily stayed in the corner and Vane's men arranged themselves around the room in the configuration of people trying to look relaxed, who were not relaxed. The results came up on Dr. Morrow's screen, and Emily watched the woman's face go carefully blank. That particular blankness, the professional version, the one that happened when you saw something on a scan that you had not expected and needed a moment before you said it out loud, she recognized that too. There's a fragment, Dr. Morrow said. Vane straightened. What kind of fragment? Metal. Approximately 4 millimeters. It's seated against the inferior angle of the scapula. The tissue around it has been stable for years, from the look of the encapsulation. She turned the screen slightly so Vane could see it. Emily stayed where she was. But there's been recent movement. I'd need the previous imaging to confirm, but the inflammatory markers around it are new. How new? Weeks, maybe less. Dr. Morrow set the screen down and looked at Rook, who was still sitting on the table watching Emily. If this shifts any further, it could compromise the nerve bundle underneath. Depending on the direction, she stopped. Say it, Vane said. He could lose function in the entire limb. It would be permanent. The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. Emily looked at the fragment on the screen. 4 millimeters. The size of a fingernail clipping. She thought about what kind of event put a piece of metal like that deep into the shoulder of a dog, under layers of muscle and tissue, close enough to a nerve bundle to matter, far enough from the surface that 6 years of routine exams had missed it. She thought about a very particular kind of event. She thought about Blackstone Ridge. The thought arrived the way bad memories always did, not as images, but as physical sensation. The smell of concrete dust, the sound of the extraction bird's rotors, the way the radio had crackled and gone silent. She looked up. Vane was looking at her. Not the way he'd been looking at her before. Not the careful suspicion. Not the professional assessment. This was something else. Recognition, maybe. Or the beginning of it. Where did you deploy? He asked again. Quieter this time. She kept her expression level. We need to get him into surgery. That fragment can't wait. I know it can't. He took one step toward her. Just one. Enough to change the geometry of the room. Emily Carr, charge nurse. 2 Army deployments. His voice was doing something controlled and careful that she recognized as the sound of someone managing a very large amount of feeling. That's all I know about you. That's all you need. It's not. He stopped. His jaw worked once. My brother's name was Daniel Vane. He died 6 years ago during a classified extraction operation. The medic on the ground that night, he paused. The medic's name was redacted from the after-action report. Every name was redacted except his. Emily didn't move. The operation was called Blackstone Ridge, Vane said. The room was very still. Rook, sitting on the exam table between them, turned his head and looked at Emily. The red paracord tied around his harness. Old, fraying at one end, wrapped twice around the joint where the vest met the leash clip, caught the light. Emily had tied that cord there herself. 6 years ago, in the dark, with Daniel Vane's hands guiding hers because hers were shaking too badly to do it alone. She looked at Marcus Vane's face and understood exactly what was about to happen. We need to get your dog to surgery, she said. Her voice didn't shake. It never did. After that, she held his gaze. After that, we can talk about whatever you need to talk about. Vane stared at her. Then he looked down at the red cord on Rook's harness. Something crossed his face that she had no name for. "That cord," he said very quietly. "Where did that come from?" Emily said nothing, and that silence was its own kind of answer. They prepped Rook for emergency surgery in the base surgical facility. Dr. Morrow had made the call within minutes of seeing the imaging, and a transport vehicle was already outside by the time the paperwork cleared. Emily had no reason to go. This was not her patient. This was not her department. This was a military working dog belonging to a Navy SEAL unit out of Fort Aldrin, and it was not her concern. She went anyway. Nobody stopped her. Maybe they didn't know how. Or maybe Vane had said something. She'd been down the hall when he spoke to Orban after looking at the cord, and she hadn't been able to hear it, and she hadn't let herself look at his face again because she needed to stay focused, and looking at his face right now was a problem she couldn't afford. She sat in a hard plastic chair in the hallway outside the surgical suite and did not let herself think about Daniel. She thought about the surgery instead. The placement of the fragment, the angle Dr. Morrow had described, the inflammatory zone around it. She thought about what it would take to extract something that had been there for 6 years without causing the nerve damage they were trying to prevent. She thought about how Rook had pressed against her in that corridor, how he'd known the phrase, how he still knew it 6 years later in a hospital hallway, with his handler losing control and 6 armed men in the room. She heard footsteps and didn't look up. Marcus Vane sat down in the chair next to her, not beside her, one seat over, with an empty chair between them, which she understood as the deliberate choice it was. For a while, neither of them said anything. "I've been looking for her for 6 years, he said finally. "The medic. I thought—" He stopped, started again. The report said the wounded were evacuated and the team lead was lost. It said the medic followed protocol. He exhaled through his nose. "I didn't believe that." "Why not?" "Because Daniel wouldn't have let anyone follow protocol in that situation. He would have—" His voice caught once, controlled. "He would have done something, and whoever was there would have either stopped him or helped him. Protocol wouldn't enter into it." Emily looked at her hands. "I spent 6 years," Vane said, "believing someone left him." The chair between them felt like a mile. "That cord," he said. "Daniel had one. Same color. He always wore it." A beat. "He said it was good luck." Emily stood up. Not because she was leaving. She wasn't. But because sitting still with this was no longer something she could do, and she needed to move or she was going to say something before she was ready to say it. She walked to the window at the end of the hallway. Outside, the Fort Aldrin grounds stretched flat and gray under an October sky, and there was nothing beautiful about it, just that kind of functional military flatness that she had grown up seeing and still felt, weirdly, like home. She heard him stand up. She heard him walk toward her. She spoke before he reached her. "The report wasn't wrong," she said. "The wounded were evacuated. Protocol was followed." She kept looking at the window. "It just didn't say everything that happened after." Behind her, Marcus Vane was very still. After the transport lifted, she stopped, made herself continue. "I went back." The hallway was completely silent. "Emily," he said. One word. "Don't." She turned around. His face was doing something she wasn't equipped to look at right now, so she looked at the wall past his shoulder instead. "Don't do that yet. Let the dog get through surgery. Then we'll talk." He stood there. Then he nodded. She walked back to her chair and sat down. He sat down 2 seats away. The space between them was still there, but it felt different now. Less like distance and more like the particular quiet that fills up a room, right before something that has been buried for a very long time finally breaks through the surface. Down the hall, behind the surgical suite doors, Rook was on the table. The red cord was with him. Emily pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum, where her heart was doing something irregular and unhelpful, and she breathed through it the way she'd learned to breathe through everything. She told herself she was ready for whatever came next. She wasn't sure she believed it. But she had been wrong about her own readiness before, and she had survived those times too, and that was going to have to be enough. The surgery took 3 hours and 14 minutes. Emily knew because she watched the clock on the wall across from her chair for most of it. Not because she was anxious. She was anxious, but that wasn't why she watched. But because keeping track of time was a habit she'd picked up in the field, where knowing exactly how long something had been going on was often the difference between a decision that saved someone and one that didn't. 3 hours and 14 minutes was a long time for a fragment extraction. It meant either the placement had been more complicated than the imaging suggested, or Dr. Morrow was being meticulous in a way that Emily respected and was quietly grateful for. Vane spent the first hour on his phone, standing at the far end of the hallway with his back to her, speaking in a low voice that carried no specific words. Orban sat across from Emily and didn't speak to her directly, but she caught him looking at her twice with an expression that wasn't hostile so much as carefully evaluating, the way someone looks at a problem they haven't figured out yet. The other men rotated in and out. Someone went for coffee. Someone found chairs from somewhere. DeLuca sat on the floor near the surgical suite doors with his knees up and his head back and his eyes closed, though Emily doubted he was sleeping. She didn't sleep either. At some point, Patricia Holden appeared at the end of the corridor. Patricia was 51, the nursing supervisor for the entire East Wing, and she had the particular energy of someone who had been managing crises for so long that she'd stopped registering them as crises and now experienced them as scheduling problems. She was a good supervisor in the ways that mattered. She didn't throw her staff under. She handled the administration so they could do their actual jobs. She noticed when someone was burning out before they did. She was also, Emily had discovered over 4 years, deeply uncomfortable with anything that deviated from the established order of how a hospital was supposed to run. A military K-9 in emergency surgery 2 floors above the civilian ward definitely counted as deviation. Emily, Patricia stopped a few feet away. She looked at the men in the hallway, then at Emily, then back at the men. Can I ask what you're still doing here? Your shift started 40 minutes ago. Rook, the dog. He was in my ward when the issue was identified. I'm following the case. He's not your patient. I know. Your patients are downstairs. Patricia lowered her voice, which didn't make it less pointed. I have 2 call-outs today, and Mrs. Ferraro in 14 keeps pulling her own IV, and I need my charge nurse actually charging. I'll be down in 30 minutes. Emily, Patricia. She met her supervisor's eyes. Not confrontational, just level. 30 minutes. Patricia looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at the surgical suite doors. Then she looked at Vane, who had turned from his phone call and was watching the exchange with an expression Emily couldn't interpret. 30 minutes, Patricia said, and left. Vane crossed the hallway and sat down. Not 2 chairs over this time, but the one directly beside her. Emily noticed but didn't move. You don't have to stay, he said. I know. You have a job to do. So do you. She nodded toward the surgical suite. And right now it involves sitting here, same as me. He didn't say anything for a moment. He had the look of someone who had spent a long time being in charge of situations and was now in a situation where that wasn't useful and was not handling the transition gracefully. She recognized it. She'd seen it in herself once or twice, in mirrors. The phrase, he said, lantern out, come home. A pause. Where did you hear it? She had been expecting this question. She had been working out for the past 3 hours how much to say before she knew whether she could trust him with the rest of it. From the team leader on Blackstone Ridge. He was very still beside her. He used it with the dog, she said, at the end, when he wanted Rook to stand down. Daniel trained him. His voice was quiet. He was the one who... He stopped. Daniel worked with Rook for 2 years before the operation. He had his own commands, off-book ones. A beat. Nobody outside the unit knew them. I was outside the unit. I know. He looked at the floor. That's what I'm trying to work out. Dr. Morrow came out through the surgical suite doors at 11:43 and found Emily standing up before she'd consciously decided to stand. The vet looked tired in the way that meant the surgery had demanded something, but her expression had lost the careful blankness from earlier, which Emily read as positive. He's out. He did well. Dr. Morrow pulled off her surgical cap and held it in both hands. The fragment is out. Clean extraction. It had migrated approximately 2 millimeters from its original position, which is why the inflammatory markers were elevated. The nerve bundle is intact. Vane exhaled beside Emily. Just once, quick and controlled, but she heard it. Recovery timeline? He asked. Weeks, not days. He'll need restricted activity, anti-inflammatories, and follow-up imaging at 2 weeks and 6 weeks. Dr. Morrow looked between them. He can't be deployed during recovery. He can't train during recovery. I want that in writing before he leaves this building. You'll have it, Vane said. Emily sat back down. She felt the tension leave her shoulders in a slow, uneven way, not all at once, which was how it always went when something she'd been bracing for didn't become the worst version of itself. She gave herself about 4 seconds of that. Then Patricia's voice came over the intercom calling for the charge nurse in the East Wing, and Emily stood up, straightened her badge, and picked up her bag. I have to go, she told Vane. He stood up too. Emily. She looked at him. Whatever happened out there, he said, I need to know. All of it. I know you do. She held his gaze. But right now I have a woman in room 14 who keeps pulling her own IV, and I need to deal with that before I deal with anything else. She paused. Come find me at the end of my shift, 7 o'clock. He nodded. She walked away. She made it to the elevator before she let herself breathe the way she'd needed to breathe for the past 4 hours. Slow and deliberate and deeper than normal. And by the time the doors opened on the patient floor, she had her face arranged back into something that would read, to anyone looking, as simply the charge nurse arriving slightly late. Mrs. Ferraro had, in fact, pulled her IV again. The rest of the shift was the kind of relentless that didn't leave room for thinking about anything else, which was probably a mercy. 3 admissions from the ER, a procedure that ran long in room 9, and a family in the waiting area who had been there since the previous evening and were starting to come apart in the quiet, escalating way that required careful management. Emily handled all of it in the automatic, competent way she'd learned to handle it. Not on autopilot exactly, but on something adjacent to it, some trained layer of herself that could run the floor while the rest of her was somewhere else entirely. The floor was what she focused on. She checked in on the military wing patients twice. The 3 Fort Aldrin men currently under her care were uncomplicated cases. 1 post-surgical recovery, 1 respiratory infection, 1 stress fracture from a training incident, and none of them required more than a medication check and a brief conversation. But she lingered a moment longer than necessary at the window of each room because she was doing the thing she did when she was managing something difficult, which was to make herself useful in small and immediate ways as a way of staying inside her own body. She had learned that trick from Daniel, actually. She tried not to think about that. At 4 in the afternoon, DeLuca appeared at the nurse's station. He looked like he'd washed his face somewhere and straightened his uniform and was trying to project a calm that hadn't quite taken hold yet. He was younger than she'd initially registered, maybe 26, 27, with a kind of earnest anxiety that he was actively working to suppress and not entirely succeeding at. Commander Vane wants to know if you need anything, he said, from the cafeteria or wherever. Emily looked at him. He sent you to ask if I needed a snack. He said, DeLuca stopped. He said to make sure you'd eaten. She hadn't. She looked at the clock on the wall, 4:03. And the last thing she'd put in her body was coffee at 6:30 that morning, which was normal for a shift that went sideways, but she felt it now that her attention was on it. Coffee, black, whatever's freshest. Yeah, okay. He didn't leave immediately. He stood there with his hands in his pockets, which was not the posture of a man who had only come to ask about coffee. You really served? Army? 2 deployments. Combat medic? 8. Whiskey. He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're recalibrating their understanding of someone they'd already filed into a category. I didn't know. When Rook went off, I wasn't expecting someone to, it's fine. It wasn't, he said. It wasn't fine. He could have hurt you. He could have hurt someone. I lost control of him, and I shouldn't have. He said it the way someone says something they've been rehearsing for hours, getting the words out before they change their mind. I'm sorry. Emily looked at him properly. I was standing straight, meeting her eyes, and he was genuinely mortified in a way that had nothing performative about it. What set him off? She asked. DeLuca's jaw tightened. I'm not asking for classified information. I'm asking because I work in this building, and if he comes back through here, I need to know what the trigger was. He looked at his shoes, then back up. We passed one of the patient rooms. There was a guy in there, the Fort Aldrin stress fracture case. He was on the phone, and his voice. DeLuca shook his head. Something about it. Rook locked on, and I wasn't fast enough to redirect. Emily thought about that. Stress fracture, room 7. She ran through what she knew about the patient. Sergeant First Class Brennan Wade, 38, training injury, admitted 4 days ago. She hadn't had any reason to think about him beyond his chart. Okay, she said. Thank you. DeLuca nodded and went to get the coffee. Emily stood at the nurse's station for a moment with her hands flat on the desk and thought about a dog reacting to a voice. About what kind of experience would wire an animal to respond that way. About what Rook had been through 6 years ago at Blackstone Ridge, that had left a metal fragment in his shoulder and a set of off-book commands in his memory, and a reaction she hadn't been able to fully account for until now. She thought about room 7. She told herself it wasn't her business. She told herself that for about 2 minutes. Then she picked up Brennan Wade's chart. There was nothing obviously wrong with the chart. Post-surgical notes, physical therapy progress, standard stress fracture recovery timeline. I was scheduled for discharge in 3 days. His emergency contact was a sister in Raleigh. His service record, the portion of it that appeared in the hospital file, listed his current unit as a training and evaluation group out of Fort Aldrin. Fort Aldrin. Emily set the chart down. She went back to her work. She made it through the medication rounds and the 4:30 family meeting and the 5 o'clock check-in with the incoming evening shift supervisor before the thing she'd been not thinking about broke through the surface in a way she couldn't put back down. She went to the hallway outside room 7 and stood there for a moment, looking at the closed door, listening to the sounds from inside. A television, low, some kind of news program, the occasional shift of someone repositioning in a hospital bed. She wasn't sure what she was doing here. She knocked and pushed the door open. Brennan Wade was sitting up in bed with the remote control in one hand and the other arm crossed over his chest in the particular way of someone who has been uncomfortable for so long, they've stopped trying to find a better position. He was broad through the shoulders, with close-cropped gray at his temples, and a face that had been through some weather. He looked at her with the flat, unreadable expression that certain kinds of men develop after years in environments where showing your reaction to things is a liability. Medication check, she said, though she had already done his. I got mine an hour ago. I know, I'm also checking in on the adjustment. Some patients find the second day after a dosage change uncomfortable. He looked at her for a moment. She hadn't changed his dosage. He probably knew that. Fine, he said. I'm fine. She looked around the room in the way nurses do when they're ostensibly checking the environment. IV line, call button placement, water pitcher, and let her eyes pass over him once. Not clinically, but the other way. The way she'd learned to look at people in the field, when reading someone fast and accurately was important. He was tense. Not the way a man with a stress fracture is tense from pain. The other kind. The dog earlier, she said. In the hallway. I wanted to make sure the disruption didn't cause you any additional stress. Something shifted in his face. Very slight. I heard something in the hallway. Didn't see it. Military working dog. He's been with us for a procedure. From the base? Fort Aldrin unit. She watched him. K9 team. His expression didn't change. That was the tell. Most people, when you mention a K9 team in their hospital, react in some way. Curiosity, interest, a question. He reacted with nothing, which was itself a reaction. Anyway, she said, if you need anything before the evening shift takes over, hit the call button. She turned toward the door. Which unit? He said. She looked back. Sorry? The K9 unit. Which one? I don't have that information, she said, which was true enough. Have a good evening. She walked out, closed the door behind her, and stood in the hallway breathing quietly and thinking about the fact that a man she had no prior reason to think about had just asked a very specific question in a very carefully casual voice, and that his unit was listed as training and evaluation, which was the kind of designation that sometimes meant exactly what it said and sometimes meant something else entirely. She thought about Rook locking onto his voice. She thought about a voice that could do that to a dog trained by Daniel Vane. She walked back to the nurses' station and pulled up the Fort Aldrin base directory on the hospital's internal liaison system, the system the hospital used to coordinate with the base on patient care, and she typed in Brennan Wade's name and his listed unit. The entry came back with a flag she hadn't seen before on a patient file. It was a small thing, just a notation in the coordination field. But it said the unit designation had been updated 14 months ago, and the previous designation was listed as a classified extraction support group under a project title that had been redacted. The redaction was a black bar, 3 inches wide. Emily stared at it. The Extraction Support Group designation had a date range. It had ended the same year as Blackstone Ridge. She closed the screen. She sat with that for 60 seconds, which was all she allowed herself. And then she did the thing she had learned to do when she found something that mattered before she was ready to act on it. She filed it, carefully, in the part of her that didn't panic, and she went back to work. At 6:55, she found Vane waiting near the elevator bank at the end of the corridor. He had changed into civilian clothes, dark jeans, a gray pullover, which made him look both less official and somehow more dangerous, the way very trained people sometimes look when you take the uniform off. He was standing with his arms at his sides and his back to the wall, not leaning, just existing in the space with the particular stillness she'd noticed from the beginning. Orban was with him. Emily came to a stop. She looked at Orban, then at Vane. "I thought we were talking alone," she said. "He stays," Vane said. Not apologetically, just as a fact. She decided not to fight it. "Okay." She looked around the corridor, said, a couple of nurses at the far end, no one within earshot. Not here, though. They found an empty consultation room 3 doors down. Emily turned on the lights and sat on the edge of the table. Vane took the chair across from her. Orban stood near the door. She thought about how to start. She thought about the 14 months she'd spent after Blackstone Ridge trying to file a supplemental report that nobody in the chain of command seemed interested in receiving. She thought about the honorable discharge that had come 6 months after that, framed as a routine separation, with a letter that praised her service and said nothing about anything. She thought about the 4 years she'd spent here, at this hospital, with the particular quality of someone who has set something down and is walking away from it because carrying it was no longer survivable. "I need to ask you something first," she said, "before I tell you anything." Vane nodded. "Brennan Wade, room 7, stress fracture, Fort Aldrin." She watched his face. "You know who he is." The silence that followed was half a second too long. "He's a patient," Vane said. "He's a patient whose unit designation has a classified redaction that ends the same year as the operation your brother died in." She kept her voice level. "And your dog locked onto his voice in the hallway today. A dog trained by Daniel, with commands that, according to you, nobody outside the unit knew." Orban shifted his weight by the door. Vane's jaw was very tight. He was looking at her with something that had moved past wariness into something harder and less readable. "How did you find the unit designation?" he asked. "Hospital liaison system. It's not classified from the patient care side." She paused. "I wasn't looking for it, but I found it." "Emily, is he part of what happened at Blackstone Ridge?" The question sat between them. Vane looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Orban. Something passed between them that she couldn't read. "What do you know," Vane said carefully, "about who ordered the extraction that night?" Emily felt something cold move through her, because that wasn't the question of a man who was learning something new. That was the question of a man who already knew the answer and was trying to find out how much she knew. "Tell me what you're here for," she said. "The real reason. Not Rook's follow-up appointment, not a routine liaison visit." She looked at his face, at the exhaustion that had been there since morning, the kind that didn't come from one bad night. "You came here for a reason, and it wasn't the dog." Vane was quiet for 4 full seconds. "No," he said, "it wasn't just the dog." The fluorescent light above them buzzed once, then settled. "We've been building a case," Orban said from the door. His voice was quieter than she'd expected, and careful. "For 14 months. Wade is part of it." He paused. "We didn't know you were here." "What kind of case?" Emily said. "The kind," Vane said, "that explains why the names in that after-action report were redacted." He leaned forward slightly. "Not to protect the mission, to protect someone who made a decision that night that had nothing to do with protocol." His eyes didn't leave hers. "Someone who decided the extraction parameters before the team hit the ground, who determined who came out and who didn't." A beat. "And who's been 3 floors above us in a hospital bed for 4 days?" Emily looked at the wall. She thought about Daniel in the dark, tying the cord around Rook's harness. She thought about the voice she'd heard crackling over the radio that night. Not the team's radio, the other one, the one that wasn't supposed to be on that frequency, giving instructions in a flat, unhurried tone while the building came down around them. She thought about the ways she'd never been able to prove that the voice existed, because the recording had been flagged as corrupted in the after-action files, and the corruption had been logged as equipment failure. I heard him, she said, that night, on a frequency he shouldn't have been on. Vane went very still. I put it in my supplemental report, she said, the one that was never received. She met his eyes. I have a copy. The room was absolutely silent. Orban pushed off the wall. Vane stood up from his chair. And down the hall, in room 7, a call button began to ring at the nurse's station. Insistent, then silent, then insistent again. In the particular pattern that meant a patient had just realized something they hadn't counted on, and had hit the button not because they needed a nurse, but because they needed to know if anyone was coming. Part 3. Emily was already moving before Vane reached the door. Not running. She never ran in patient corridors unless someone was coding. But the fast, purposeful walk that the staff recognized as meaning something had shifted and the normal rules of the next few minutes were suspended. She was out of the consultation room and into the hallway before either man could say anything, and she heard them fall in behind her, which she didn't stop to address. The call button pattern from room 7 had stopped. That was worse. A patient who hits the call button in a panic and then stops. Either they calmed down or they decided they didn't want anyone coming after all, and in her experience, the second option was more common and more concerning. She pushed open the door to room 7 without knocking. Wade was sitting up in bed, phone in hand, thumb moving across the screen. He looked up when she came in, and his expression did the things she'd clocked before. Not quite neutral, too controlled for what the situation called for. He'd been a man who spent years making his face do nothing on command, and right now it was doing nothing in the way that meant everything. I hit the button by accident, he said. Okay. She crossed to the IV stand, checked the line, checked the site on his arm, made herself look like that was why she was there. How's the pain level? Same as this morning. Are you sure? Sometimes with a dosage change? I didn't have a dosage change. He was looking at her steadily, not hostile, measuring. You mentioned that earlier. I don't have a dosage change on my chart. You're right, she said. My mistake. Long shift. She straightened up, made a note on the tablet she'd grabbed from the hallway rack on her way past. I'll let you get some rest. She turned to go. The K9 unit, he said. Did they leave? She stopped with her back, gave herself 1 full second. Not yet. The dog is still recovering. A pause. Which handler? Just curious. I know a few of the K9 guys from the base. She turned around. I don't have that information. He was still measuring her. She kept her face at the exact same temperature it had been when she walked in, not warmer, not cooler, and held his gaze for 2 seconds, then looked at her tablet, then looked back at him once more with the professional finality that meant the conversation was over. Hit the call button if you need anything, she said. She walked out. In the hallway, Vane and Orban were waiting. She walked past them without stopping and made it 6 steps before Vane fell into stride beside her. He was on his phone, she said quietly. We heard. He knows you're here. She kept walking. Or he suspects. Either way, he's making a call. To who? I don't know. But if he has any kind of support network and he's been here 4 days already, he has options. She stopped at the nurse's station, set the tablet down, and turned to face them. The evening shift was filtering in at the far end of the hall, which meant she had maybe 6 minutes before the changeover made this conversation impossible. Whatever case you're building, how close are you? Vane and Orban exchanged a look. Close enough that we came here, Orban said. That's not an answer. Close enough, Vane said, that having a witness who heard the voice on that frequency and kept a copy of the supplemental report changes the timeline significantly. She looked at him. What does significantly mean? It means we can move faster than we planned. How much faster? That depends on what's in the report and whether it matches what we already have. She thought about the USB drive in the lockbox in her apartment, which she had not accessed in 14 months, because accessing it felt like opening a door she'd decided to keep closed. She thought about the evening she'd made the copy, sitting in her car in the parking lot of a storage facility in Raleigh, hands steadier than she'd expected them to be, telling herself she was doing it as insurance and trying not to think about what she might eventually need to be insured against. I need to finish shift handover, she said, and I need you to have someone watching room 7 before I go anywhere." "DeLuca's already in the corridor," Orban said. She hadn't seen him there. She looked down the hall and saw the edge of a sleeve near the water fountain, positioned in the casual, intentional way of someone who wasn't trying to look like they were watching a door while absolutely watching a door. "Okay," she said. The shift handover took 22 minutes, which was fast. The incoming charge nurse was a woman named Greta Pell, who had been doing this longer than Emily and needed minimal briefing, which was one of the things Emily genuinely liked about working with her. Emily ran through the patient list, flagged Mrs. Ferraro's IV situation, mentioned the military patients in the wing in the clinical language of a normal handover, and said nothing about room 7 beyond the standard notes. Greta gave her a look at the end. "You look terrible." "Thanks. I feel great." "Go home and eat something." "Working on it." She clocked out at 7:19 and found Vane waiting in the parking structure, standing beside a black SUV she didn't recognize. Orban was in the passenger seat. The engine was running. "My car's here," she said. "We'll bring you back for it." She looked at the SUV. She thought about the specific calculus of getting into a vehicle with people she didn't fully know, going to a location she hadn't chosen, to retrieve evidence that was currently the most valuable thing she owned. She thought about Daniel. She got in. Her apartment was 20 minutes from the hospital, a third-floor unit in a building that had been someone's idea of affordable modern in 2018 and was now just regular, with the kind of hallways that smelled faintly of other people's cooking and the occasional dog. She had lived there for 3 years, and the most personal things she'd done to the space were a bookshelf by the window and a reasonable coffee maker. She had not put photographs up. She was aware this was a choice. She let them into the lobby, up the elevator, into the apartment. Vane looked around in the way she'd expected, taking in the space, cataloging it, making assessments she couldn't fully see. Orban stood near the door. She went straight to the bedroom closet, moved a box of winter things off the upper shelf, and retrieved the lockbox. She sat down at the kitchen table and opened it. The USB drive was there, along with 2 folded pieces of paper. The handwritten notes she'd made immediately after filing the supplemental report, while the details were still sharp, and a photograph she didn't look at directly. She plugged the drive into her laptop and turned the screen so Vane could see it from across the table. "The supplemental report is the first file," she said. "The audio clip is the second." He reached across and clicked without asking. She let him. She watched his face while he read, which told her more than the document itself at this point. He was very controlled, but she'd been watching him for 12 hours now, and she'd learned the specific set of his jaw that meant he was reading something that mattered. 14 months, he said without looking up. "You had this for 14 months. "I had it for 6 years, the copy I made 14 months ago." She watched him. "Something changed 14 months ago. On my end. What changed on yours?" He finally looked up. "Someone talked." "Someone from the unit?" "Someone adjacent to it. Low enough in the chain that nobody had thought to manage what they knew." He held her gaze. "They came to us. What they said matched enough of the operational record that we started pulling threads. And one of those threads led here. Eventually." He clicked to the audio file. "Can you play this?" She leaned across and clicked it herself. The audio was 43 seconds. The quality was poor. She'd recorded it from the radio speaker on her phone, in the dark, with her hands not entirely steady, and there was ambient noise under it, the sound of debris and wind and someone in the distance saying something she couldn't make out. But the voice was clear enough, flat and precise and unhurried, giving extraction parameters that didn't match the operational plan, naming a sequence that, if you knew what you were listening to, explained exactly why the helicopter had come with room for 3 and not 4. The voice was Brennan Wade's. She knew that now. She'd heard him speak this afternoon, for the first time since that night, and the register of it had hit her somewhere below conscious thought and stayed there, working its way through her, until it became a certainty that she couldn't unknow. She watched Vane's face while the audio played. When it ended, the apartment was very quiet. Orban had moved away from the door. He was standing at the edge of the kitchen now, and his expression had dropped the careful neutrality he'd been maintaining since the consultation room. "That's enough," he said. Not to Emily, to Vane. "We need the original," Vane said. "The radio log. If she filed a supplemental that referenced a transmission." The transmission was logged as corrupted, equipment failure. Emily had rehearsed this in her head many times. I flagged it in the supplemental as inconsistent with what I heard live. The base comm log would have a timestamp gap where it should appear. She looked at him. Your people can pull that. They can. How long would it take? With the right authorization, Orban said. Hours. Vane sat back. He put both hands flat on the table and looked at the laptop screen for a moment. She could see him working through something, the tactical shape of it, the order of operations, what needed to happen, and in what sequence. She recognized the particular quality of that silence. She'd been in enough rooms with people making decisions that had real consequences to know what it looked like from the outside. We have a problem, he said finally. Wade, she said. Wade. He nodded. If he's making calls and if whoever he's calling has any ability to move him, he's a patient. He can check himself out. Orban's voice was flat. AMA discharge. It takes 20 minutes. If someone picks him up from the parking lot, we lose him. Emily thought about the call button, the phone in his hand, the question about which handler. We need to go back, she said. Not we, Vane said. You're not. He doesn't know you're on to him specifically, she said. He suspects you're there, but he doesn't know why. To him, right now, I'm still just the charge nurse who checked his IV. She held Vane's gaze. If I go back and he's preparing to leave, I can slow it down. Create a reason to delay his discharge paperwork. That's my hospital, she said. And right now it's your best option. Vane stared at her. Orban said something quietly in Vane's direction that she caught the edge of, she's not wrong. And Vane's jaw did the thing it did when he was accepting something he didn't want to accept. 30 minutes, he said. We'll have the authorization moving before we get back. She unplugged the drive and held it out to him. He took it, looked at it for a moment. You kept this for 6 years. Someone had to. She picked up her bag and her keys and went back out the door. Oh, they made the drive in 19 minutes. Orban had his phone out the whole way, speaking in clipped half-sentences to someone Emily couldn't hear, using terminology she caught pieces of, and understood enough of to know that the machinery she'd been hoping might exist somewhere was now actually moving. She sat in the back seat and watched the streetlights go by, and did not let herself feel the magnitude of this yet, because feeling the magnitude of things was something she did after, when the immediate problem was resolved and there was space for it. The hospital parking structure. She got out. 30 minutes, Vane's entrance, took the stairs, faster than the elevator if you knew the layout, and came out on the patient floor at 7:52. Greta Pell was at the nurse's station. She looked up when Emily appeared, and her expression went from surprise to guarded in about a second. I forgot to flag something, Emily said. Room 7. I need to check in. I just did rounds. He has a specific follow-up concern. 2 minutes. Greta looked like she had thoughts about this that she was professionally suppressing. 2 minutes, she said. Emily walked to room 7. The door was open 4 inches. She pushed it wider. Wade was dressed, not hospital-gowned, not in the in-between state of someone considering leaving. Dressed, street clothes, jacket, the kind of casual speed that meant he'd made a decision and was in the middle of executing it. His bag was on the bed. He was checking the zipper when the door opened and his eyes came up and hit hers. 2 seconds of stillness. I'm checking out, he said. He said it the way people say things when they've already decided and don't expect the information to be a problem. I can see that. She stepped into the room. Let the door fall mostly closed behind her. You'll need to sign an AMA form. I'll get it. I'll sign whatever you need me to sign. He picked up the bag. But I'm leaving tonight. Of course. She pulled the tablet from the corridor rack where she'd left it, Greta's, technically, but close enough, and made herself move at normal nursing speed, unhurried, the pace that said this was a routine she'd done 100 times. Your attending physician will need to be notified. That's a protocol requirement, not a delay tactic. Dr. Huang is on call tonight and he'll want to speak with you briefly before you go. I don't need... It's a liability issue, she said, for the hospital. If you leave AMA without physician acknowledgement and something happens, the hospital's exposure. She shook her head with the specific expression of someone navigating bureaucracy they didn't create and couldn't eliminate. It takes 10 minutes. Dr. Huang is fast. Wade looked at her. She met his eyes and held them and kept her face at exactly the temperature it had been every time she'd walked in here today, and she thought about the 43-second audio clip on a drive that was currently in Vane's hands in a car 6 minutes from this building, and she breathed and she waited. 10 minutes, he said. I'll page him now. She moved to the corridor door, opened it, looked back once. Can I get you anything while you wait? Water, coffee? Nothing. His voice had gone flat in the particular way of someone running out of patience they'd been rationing. Just the doctor. She let the door close. In the hallway, she did not run. She walked to the nurse's station, where Greta was watching her with an expression that had moved well past professional suppression into active concern, and she picked up the desk phone and called not Dr. Huang, who was on call and would come eventually, but the extension for hospital security. This is Emily Carr, charge nurse East Wing day shift. I need a security presence on the 4th floor for an AMA discharge situation. Patient is ambulatory, cooperative, but there are concerns about the discharge circumstances. She paused. And I need you to call your liaison contact at Fort Aldrin, tonight. There was a pause on the other end. Ma'am, a liaison call for a security situation is... I know what it is, she said. Make the call. She hung up. Greta was staring at her. Don't ask, Emily said. I wasn't going to, Greta said, which was almost certainly untrue. Emily's phone buzzed in her pocket, a text from a number she'd given Vane in the car. 8 minutes out. Hold him. She looked at the text. 8 minutes. She'd bought maybe 7 with the AMA protocol. Wade wasn't stupid. He was already calculating whether the 10 minutes he'd agreed to were real or stalling, and she gave herself maybe 5 more before that calculation landed somewhere uncomfortable. She needed another delay. She walked back to the nurse's station, picked up the internal phone, and paged Dr. Huang with the priority code she almost never used, the one that meant a physician was needed at bedside within 3 minutes, not 10. Huang was going to be irritated. She'd deal with that. Then she went back to room 7. Wade was standing by the window, bag over his shoulder, watching the parking structure across the drive below. His posture had changed in the 4 minutes she'd been gone. The weight distribution different, the set of his shoulders higher. He'd made another decision, and she didn't think it was to stay. Dr. Huang is on his way up, she said. I changed my mind. He moved toward the door. Tell him thanks anyway. She didn't step in front of him. That wasn't something she was going to do, physically block a large trained man in a small room. But she moved to the door ahead of him and stood just inside the frame in the way that wasn't quite blocking and wasn't quite not blocking. Mr. Wade, she said, I need you to understand that leaving this room right now, without the AMA form, without physician acknowledgement, is going to create a situation I can't manage from the inside. She held his gaze. I'm trying to help you. It was a gamble. She didn't know if it would read as genuine or as exactly the stall it was. He stopped, looked at her. His eyes moved over her face in a way that reminded her of Vane earlier in the day. That specific assessment, that recalibration. Who else is in this building? He said. I'm not... Don't. His voice had dropped to something quiet and close to dangerous. I know someone tipped. I know why you keep coming back to this room. So tell me who else is here and maybe this goes a different way. She was very still. The dog, he said. Lantern out. Come home. His jaw was tight. Only one person ever used that phrase with that animal, and that person is dead. He took a step toward her. So either you tell me who's been asking about me, or I walk out this door and you can explain to whoever sent you why you let me go. Down the hall, the elevator chimed. Wade's eyes moved to the sound. And in that half-second window, while his attention broke, the door behind Emily opened from the outside. DeLuca, who had clearly been listening through the gap in the frame, and the hallway behind him held Vane and Orban and 2 other men in civilian clothes who carried themselves in the way that closed off exits without being near any of them. Wade went very still. He looked at Vane. Something moved through his face that she couldn't name. Not fear exactly, not surprise exactly, something older and more complicated than either. Marcus, he said. Brennan. Vane stepped into the room. His voice was flat and even and contained everything it was containing through what was clearly a significant act of will. Sit down. I'm leaving. You're not. Vane looked at him steadily. We have the audio. We have the comm log gap. We have the supplemental report that was never received, and we have two more people who are going to say the same thing she said. He nodded toward Emily. The authorization came through 20 minutes ago. Jag is already at the base. A beat. You can sit down and we can do this here, or you can walk out that door and add obstruction to everything else. Your choice. The room was completely silent. Emily moved out of the doorway. She moved until her back was against the wall beside the window. Out of the way, visible, not in anyone's path. She watched Wade's face. She watched the moment when the calculation shifted, when what he'd been holding on to for 6 years became something he could no longer hold the weight of. It wasn't dramatic. It was small and precise, like a structure developing a crack so fine you almost missed it. He set his bag down on the floor. He sat on the edge of the bed, and the room held itself still around that, all of them in it together. The distance between what had happened 6 years ago and what was happening now collapsed into this one ordinary room with its bad lighting and its IV stand and its window looking out over a parking structure. Emily was looking at Vane. Vane was looking at Wade. Wade was looking at his own hands. There were orders, Wade said. His voice was different now, not flat anymore. The control had cost him something, and the cost was showing. You understand that, Marcus. There were orders that came from above both of us. I know, Vane said. Tell us where they came from. Wade looked up. And the name, he said, quietly, in the way a man says something he has been carrying for 6 years and has just now put down, landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples going outward in every direction, hitting every surface, changing the shape of everything they touched. Emily gripped the window frame behind her. Because the name wasn't the name of a dead man. It was the name of someone who was still very much alive. Someone whose office was a 40-minute drive from this hospital. Someone who, as of that morning's news she'd barely registered on the break room television, had just been named as the lead candidate for a federal oversight position that would, in approximately 6 weeks, give them authority over every classified operation and military investigation in the continental United States. The name was Garrison Holt. Brigadier General, retired 14 months ago with full honors, a ceremony at Fort Aldrin attended by 3 senators and a Deputy Secretary of Defense. His portrait still hung in the base's main corridor. Emily had walked past it without recognition every time she came through for liaison visits, which now felt like something she needed to sit with later, when there was time. Nobody said anything for a long moment after Wade spoke it. Vane stood in the center of the room with his hands at his sides and his face doing nothing at all, which she recognized now as the specific blankness that meant he was managing something that could, if he let it, take him apart. Orban had gone still near the door. The 2 men in civilian clothes exchanged a look she couldn't fully read. Holt, Vane said finally. One word. Flat. He controlled the extraction parameters from the command level, Wade said. He was looking at his hands again, not at Vane. The bag was at his feet. He hadn't moved from the edge of the bed. I didn't know what the order meant when I got it. Not at first. The framing was operational. Threat assessment, extraction window, personnel priority. It was packaged as a tactical call. He stopped. His jaw worked once. By the time I understood what it actually was, it was already done. You understood, Vane said, 6 years ago. Yes. And you stayed quiet. A long pause. He had documentation. On me. On decisions I'd made. He made it very clear what my options were. Wade finally looked up. His face was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the stress fracture. I'm not asking you to understand that. I'm just telling you what happened. Vane looked at him for a long time. Orban, he said, without looking away from Wade. Got it, Orban said, and stepped into the hallway. Emily watched Vane's face. She watched him make the decision to put his personal feelings down. Not away, not resolved, just set aside like something he'd come back to when he could afford it, and focus on what the next 24 hours required. She'd seen people make that choice before. It was never clean. It always cost something. Is he reachable? Vane asked. Tonight? He has a residence in Dunmore, Wade said, 45 minutes north. I don't know if he's there or in the capital. He paused. His confirmation hearing is in 3 weeks. He'll be managing his exposure right now. If he knows I'm here, if anyone told him about the K9 unit visit, nobody told him, Vane said. We made sure of that. You made sure of what you knew to make sure of. Wade's voice was quiet. He's had 6 years to build contingencies. I'd be careful assuming you controlled the information. Vane absorbed that. Do you have anything documented? Your end. I have a recorded conversation from 14 months ago. A call he made to me when the JAG inquiry opened on the unrelated case. He was nervous. He said things he shouldn't have said. I kept it. Wade looked up. I kept it because I knew this day was coming eventually, and I wanted something to trade. Where is it? Not here. Where? Wade shook his head once, the gesture of a man who has one piece of leverage and is not letting go of it yet. I'll give it to Jag directly, not to you. Vane accepted this without visible reaction. Fine. Emily pushed off the wall. I need to brief my supervisor. Every head in the room turned toward her. Not about the operational details, she said, but there's a security flag on this floor now, and she's going to want to understand the basic shape of what's happening. She's not going to go outside the building with it. She looked at Vane. She's a good supervisor. She deserves to know why her floor looks like this. He considered, then nodded. She walked out into the corridor and found Greta at the nurse's station where she'd left her, still watching the end of the hallway with the expression of someone who has decided they are having a completely normal shift and will keep deciding that until someone tells them otherwise. Greta, Emily said, I need 5 minutes. She gave her supervisor the minimum that made the situation safe and comprehensible: a military investigation, a patient on the floor who was cooperating, a security requirement that would resolve by morning. Greta was sharp enough to understand that the parts she wasn't being told were the parts that mattered, and professional enough not to push. She asked 2 practical questions. Would she need to involve hospital administration, and was there any patient safety risk? And when Emily answered both, she nodded and went back to her work with the composed practicality of a woman who had learned a long time ago to manage what she could see and wait out the rest. Emily was back in the hallway when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost let it go to voicemail. Then something made her pick up. Ms. Carr? The voice was male, measured, with the particular smoothness of someone accustomed to being listened to. My name isn't important. What's important is that I know you're at Harwick Regional right now, and I know who you've been talking to. A pause. I think we should speak before this goes any further. She stopped walking. She kept her voice even. I don't know what you're... The audio recording, the supplemental report, the conversation happening in room 7 right now. Another pause. You've been careful for 6 years. That's admirable. But you're about to become the most prominent part of something that will be very difficult to control, and I want to offer you a way out of that. She looked at the door to room 7. Vane was inside. She was in the corridor. The call had come to her personal phone, which meant someone had her number, which meant the information containment Vane had been confident about was not as complete as he'd thought. She turned and walked toward the stairwell, away from the room, away from anyone who might hear. What kind of way out? She said. The report gets formally acknowledged. Your service record gets corrected. The pending case gets resolved through channels that don't require you to testify publicly. The voice was smooth and practiced. In exchange, the audio clip and any copies are turned over to an appropriate oversight body, rather than the parties you've been dealing with tonight. That sounds like you're asking me to hand over my evidence to someone I don't know. I'm asking you to trust an institutional process rather than a personal vendetta. A pause. Commander Vane has reasons for this investigation that are not entirely professional. You know that. What he does with what you've given him may not serve justice as cleanly as you'd hope. She stood in the stairwell with the door closed behind her and thought about how specific this call was. Her number. The contents of room 7. The audio clip. Someone with real-time information about what was happening in this building. Give me a name, she said. I told you. You said your name wasn't important. I'm saying it is. She kept her voice flat. If you want me to trust a process, give me a name I can verify. Otherwise, this call is over. A silence, longer than the others. Garrison Holt, he said. She closed her eyes for 1 second. I'll think about it, she said, and hung up. She stood in the stairwell for exactly 4 seconds. Then she went back through the door, walked to room 7, and opened it without knocking. He just called me, she said. Oh, The next 2 hours moved in the particular way of situations where multiple things were happening simultaneously, and the only way to track them all was to stay very focused on the one directly in front of you, and trust that the people handling the others were doing it correctly. Orban had a phone to his ear the moment she finished relaying the call. Vane was on a second phone 30 seconds after that, speaking in the clipped, precise language of someone coordinating something that had a geographic element and a time constraint. Wade sat on the bed and said nothing. His expression had settled into something that Emily could only describe as the look of a man who had been carrying something alone for so long that handing it over, even under these circumstances, had its own complicated quality to it. The call from Holt changed the timeline. That was the immediate operational reality that everything else had to account for. He knew they were at the hospital. He knew about the evidence. The 6-week window before his confirmation hearing, which had seemed like a constraint on his side, was now also a pressure on theirs. If he could move fast enough through institutional channels to discredit the investigation before it went public, the confirmation proceeding would absorb and neutralize it. He had resources, he had relationships, he had 6 years of careful positioning. What he hadn't had, until tonight, was the audio clip with the timestamp. And he didn't have it now, but he knew it existed and he knew where it had been. Vane came back to where Emily was standing near the window. "Jag is moving," he said. "They're filing the formal investigation record tonight, which creates a legal protection around the evidence chain. Once it's in that record, he can't touch it through administrative channels without triggering a separate inquiry." He looked at her. "But we need your testimony on record. Formal statement tonight if possible." "Tonight? I know it's a lot." "It's not—" She stopped, reorganized what she'd been about to say. "It's not a lot. I've been waiting 6 years to give that statement. I just need to know it's going somewhere that doesn't disappear it again." The officer handling the filing is someone Orban has worked with for 3 years. She's not connected to Holt's network. He paused. "We think." "That's reassuring." "I know." His jaw was tight. "I'm not going to tell you this is airtight. It's not. He has reach and he's going to use it. But the recording, your supplemental, Wade's statement, and the comm log gap together, that's not something you make disappear easily. Not in 3 weeks, with a confirmation hearing in the middle of it." She nodded. Then, because it was sitting there and needed to be said, "Your brother. He knew what Holt did." Vane's face changed. "Daniel knew," she said. "That night, before the end, he knew the extraction parameters had been manipulated. He figured it out from the communication sequence." She watched Vane's face carefully. "He didn't say Holt's name, but he said the order came from above the mission, and he said to make sure Rook got out because the dog was the only one who could lead back to what actually happened." She held Vane's gaze. He knew someone would come looking eventually. He was counting on it. Vane was very still. "He trusted you to come," she said. "He just didn't know how long it would take." The fluorescent light above them buzzed once in the silence. 6 years, Vane said. His voice was different, not broken. Something harder than broken. "He bought as much time as he could." She paused. "That's not nothing." Vane looked at the wall, then at the floor. Then he picked his phone back up and made the next call, and she understood that was all he was able to do with what she'd just told him right now, and that was enough. Set. The formal statement took 90 minutes. A JAG officer named Major Renata Solis arrived at the hospital at 9:43. Small, precise, with the look of someone who operated in the space between institutional rules and the things those rules were supposed to protect, and had learned to do it without losing either. She set up in the empty consultation room that Emily and Vane had used hours earlier, which felt like a week ago, and she recorded the statement on 2 separate devices with the careful redundancy of someone who had seen evidence disappear before and did not intend to let it happen again. Emily sat across from her and gave it straight. She had told this story so many times in her own head over 6 years that the language for it came out clean and specific and in the right order. The night of the Blackstone Ridge operation, the extraction parameters she'd been given, the helicopter capacity, Daniel Vane's order, the evacuation, the frequency she hadn't been supposed to hear, the voice on it giving instructions that contradicted the operational plan, her return with the second rescue team, the timing, what they found, what they didn't find. She said all of it. Major Solis didn't interrupt. She asked clarifying questions twice, both technical, both about timeline. And she wrote notes in a small notebook while the recording ran, which Emily took as the sign of someone doing this properly. When it was done, Solis looked at her across the table. You filed a supplemental 6 years ago. Yes. And again, informally, 14 months ago. I made the copy 14 months ago. I didn't file again because the first one had made it clear there was no point filing without something stronger to attach to it. The audio. Yes. Solis nodded slowly. The record is going to show a 6-year gap between the incident and this statement. Someone will try to use that. I know. The supplemental will corroborate the timing, but there will still be questions about why you waited. Because I was a civilian nurse with a USB drive and no way to know who was safe to give it to. Emily kept her voice level. I waited because I wasn't willing to hand this to the wrong person and have it go the same way as the first report. I waited until there was someone worth handing it to. Solis looked at her for a moment. Then she wrote something in the notebook. Okay, she said. She packed up her equipment at 11:15, shook Emily's hand with the firm, direct grip of someone who respected what the handshake represented, and left. The hospital had gone quiet, in the particular way of hospitals at midnight, not silent, because hospitals were never silent, but reduced to its essential sounds. The monitors, the ventilation, the occasional soft exchange at the nurse's station. Emily sat in a chair in the hallway outside the consultation room and did not try to figure out what she was feeling because there was too much of it, and most of it would need more space than she had right now. Vane found her there at 11:30. He sat down in the chair across the hall, not the 2 seats over distance of the morning, not the deliberate gap of someone managing proximity, just across the hall. Easy distance. Wade's being transferred to Fort Aldrin tonight, he said, under escort. He'll formally cooperate with the JAG investigation in exchange for consideration on the charges. He paused. He's not getting immunity, but cooperation matters in the calculus. And Holt? That's moving through channels I'm not fully in control of. He said it with the particular flatness of someone who finds that genuinely difficult. The confirmation timeline is the pressure point. If the formal investigation record is solid enough, the Senate committee gets notified through protocol before the hearing proceeds. He looked at the floor. His people are already working to characterize this as a personal grievance from me. A vendetta, like he said to you on the phone. He paused. They're not entirely wrong about my motivations. That's the part that's going to complicate things. Your motivations don't change the evidence, she said. No, but they change how the evidence gets received, politically. He looked up. I've been told to step back from the active investigation, formally, because my relationship to the victim creates a conflict. His jaw moved. I'm going to do that, because it's right, and because Daniel would have told me to. She looked at him. That's the hardest part. Yeah. They sat in this hallway quiet for a moment. Your record, he said. The official correction. Solis is filing a formal request tonight to have your service record amended to reflect the supplemental report and the unauthorized rescue attempt. He looked at her directly. It'll note that the attempt was made in direct contravention of separation orders and will formally recognize the intent and the effort. He paused. It's not the same as saying you didn't violate protocol, because you did. But it says why, and it says what you were trying to do. She hadn't expected to feel anything specific about that. She found that she did. Thank you, she said. It came out quieter than she intended. Don't thank me. It should have happened 6 years ago. He said it without deflection, without the cushioning people usually put around statements like that. Just the fact of it, plain. I'm sorry it didn't. She nodded. Once. Then she looked at the ceiling and breathed through the particular thing that was happening in her chest, which wasn't grief exactly, and wasn't relief exactly, but was the specific sensation of something that had been under pressure for a very long time, beginning, slowly, to decompress. It wasn't comfortable. Decompression rarely was. At 12:40 in the morning, Garrison Holt's attorney released a statement to 3 news outlets. Vane's phone went first, then Orban's. Then the alert came through on the security channel that Major Solis's office monitored, which was how Emily found out. She was still in the building, sitting in the break room with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and Orban came and found her. The statement described an ongoing harassment campaign by a grieving family member against a decorated officer. It named Vane specifically. It described the hospital visit as unauthorized interference with an active patient's medical care. It mentioned a civilian nurse by implication, hospital staff who have been manipulated into providing access and assistance, and it framed the audio recording as a fabrication created in the context of a years-long personal dispute. It did not mention Blackstone Ridge by name. Emily read it twice on Orban's phone. "He's moving fast," she said. "He's scared," Orban said. "Scared people move fast. It's not always smart." "This statement goes to the committee." "It already has. His people sent it to 2 committee members tonight." Orban took the phone back. "The problem is 2 of those members are in his network. They'll use it to request a delay in the formal investigation notification, which would give him breathing room before the hearing." She thought about the timing. 3 weeks to the confirmation hearing. The formal investigation record filed tonight. The statement already in committee members' hands by midnight. "He knew we were moving tonight," she said. "The call to me? That wasn't him trying to stop us. That was him buying time while he prepared this." She looked at Orban. He was never going to wait for us to come to him. Orban's expression confirmed it without him saying so. "Solis needs to know," Emily said. "Solis already knows. She's been on the phone for the last hour." He paused. "There's a problem with the comm log." She went still. "What kind of problem?" "The timestamp gap. The corrupted recording that should correspond to the transmission you heard. Base comm records from 6 years ago exist in a physical archive at Fort Aldrin and a digital backup maintained by the Command Records Office." He paused. "The digital backup was accessed 14 months ago. Someone ran a maintenance update through the records office that affected files in that date range." She understood immediately. The gap was patched. Partially. Enough to make the corruption look like equipment failure rather than selective deletion. His voice was careful and flat. "The physical archive should still have the original logs, but accessing the physical archive requires a base commander authorization, and the current base commander was appointed 18 months ago by a committee that Holt chaired." She sat with that for a moment. "The audio," she said, "my recording from my phone, that still exists. That's still in the JAG record." "It is. But it's going to be challenged now. Quality, chain of custody, context. Without the comm log to corroborate the transmission, it becomes a clip of an unidentified voice on an unspecified frequency, and his attorney can build a case that it's out of context or fabricated." Orban looked at her steadily. "It's not enough on its own. We need the physical log." "Who can authorize access to the physical archive?" she said. "The base commander, a federal court order, or—" He stopped. "Or the commanding general of the Regional Oversight Command, which is Fort Aldrin's direct superior." He paused. "That position is currently held by General Patricia Wynne. She's not in Holt's network, but she's in the capital. It's 12:50 in the morning, and making contact through proper channels takes time we don't have if Holt's people are already working the committee." Emily looked at the cold coffee in her cup. She thought about 6 years of carrying this. She thought about Daniel tying cord around a dog's harness in the dark. She thought about the 43 seconds of audio that had been sitting in a lockbox in her closet bedroom, waiting. She thought about the one thing she hadn't told anyone yet. "There's something else," she said. Orban looked at her. "The night I went back, the unauthorized rescue attempt." She set the cup down on the table. "I wasn't alone. I went back with a second team. There were 3 of us." She met his eyes. "One of them was a signals intelligence specialist. She ran a field recorder on the frequency band that night because I told her what I'd heard, and she wanted to document it." A pause. "She recorded the transmission in real time, on a separate device. Not my phone recording a speaker, a direct capture from the frequency." The break room was very quiet. "That recording," Orban said slowly, "would have a clean signal. Significantly cleaner than mine, and a timestamp that matches the operational record. Yes." "Where is it?" he said. Emily looked at him. "The specialist's name is Donna Rafe," she said. "She left the Army 2 years after Blackstone Ridge. I haven't spoken to her in 3 years." She paused. "But the last address I had for her was in Claremont, which is 90 minutes from here." Orban was already reaching for his phone. "If she still has it," Emily said, "and if she's willing, then Holt's attorney can explain away one clip," Orban said. but not two. Not one from a field recorder with a clean timestamp and a separate chain of custody. He was already moving toward the door. "I need to call Vane." Emily stood up. She followed him into the hallway. And across the building, on a floor she could no longer see, in the room where a military working dog was recovering from surgery with a red cord tied to his collar, she thought about the shape of what was still left to do. The 90-minute drive, the door she hadn't knocked on in 3 years, the question she was going to have to ask of someone who had every reason to have moved on and built something new, and might not be willing to tear it up to stand in the light of something this big. She thought about what Donna Rafe might say when she opened that door. She thought about what she herself would say. And she understood, standing in that hallway at 12:58 in the morning, that the thing she had believed was almost over was not over yet. That there was one more door between where they were and where they needed to be. And she had no way of knowing, until she stood in front of it, whether it would open. The drive to Claremont took 87 minutes because Orban drove the way people drive when the thing they're moving toward has a time limit attached to it. Not reckless, but without any of the small hesitations that normal driving involves. Emily sat in the passenger seat. Vane was in the back. Nobody talked for the first 40 minutes, which was fine. There was nothing useful to say yet. She had Donna Rafe's last known address in her phone from 3 years ago, a contact entry she'd never deleted and never used, which she'd told herself was because you never knew, and which she now understood was because some part of her had always known this day had a shape to it that wasn't finished yet. She didn't know if the address was still good. She didn't know if Donna still had the recording. She didn't know what Donna's life looked like now, or whether opening this door would cost her something she wasn't willing to pay. Those were the variables she couldn't control. What she could control was showing up. She'd learned that from combat medicine, the understanding that you cannot guarantee outcomes. You can only guarantee presence. You show up, you do the work in front of you, and you accept that some of what happens next is beyond the edge of what any person can reach. It was a hard thing to learn. She'd learned it the hard way, the way most real things got learned. At the 40-minute mark, Vane said, "Tell me about her." Emily looked out the window at the dark highway. "We served together for 8 months. She was signals intelligence, so our work overlapped mostly on the communication side of extractions. She monitored frequencies. I handled medical. She was good at her job. Very good." She paused. "She left the Army 2 years after Blackstone Ridge. Stress injury, not physical. She saw what you saw. She heard what I heard, and then she helped me go back and try to fix it, and we found—" Emily stopped. "We found what we found. That kind of thing leaves marks." Did she know what she was recording, the frequency? "I told her what I'd heard. She made the call to run the recorder herself. I didn't ask her to." She paused. "That's important. She made an independent choice to document it." Vane absorbed that. "If she's willing to produce the recording, I know." Emily turned to look at him briefly. "I'm not going to promise you she will be. She built something after she got out. A life that doesn't have any of this in it. Asking her to put that life in front of this it's a real ask." She turned back to the window. "I'm going to ask it anyway. I'm just not going to pretend it's small." He didn't say anything else. She respected that. The house was a modest 2-story on a street of similar houses in a part of Claremont that had been built in the optimistic early 2000s and had settled into comfortable ordinariness since. There was a truck in the driveway. A light was on in the front room, 1:15 in the morning. Emily got out of the car alone. She'd told them to stay. Vane had started to object, and she'd looked at him once and he'd stopped, which she took as evidence that he was smarter than his instincts sometimes allowed. She walked up the front path and knocked on the door. 30 seconds. Then a porch light came on. The door opened on a chain, and a woman looked through the gap with the flat, cautious expression of someone who has answered doors at odd hours before and has learned not to assume. She was 40, maybe 41, with close-cropped natural hair and the particular set of the face that Emily recognized. The same thing she saw in her own mirror sometimes. The look of someone who had been through something that rearranged the furniture of who they were and had spent years figuring out where to put everything. Donna Rafe looked at her for a long moment. "Emily Carr," she said. "Hi, Donna." Another moment. Then the chain came off and the door opened all the way. "You better come in," Donna said. She had coffee on within 4 minutes, which Emily took as a sign, not of welcome exactly, but of the practical hospitality of someone who understood that difficult conversations required something to do with your hands. They sat at the kitchen table, and Emily told her in plain, direct language what had happened that day, what had been filed, what they had, and what they needed. Donna listened with her hands around her mug and her expression doing very little. When Emily finished, the kitchen was quiet for a moment. "Garrison Holt," Donna said. "Yes." "He's about to be confirmed for federal oversight. In 3 weeks, unless the investigation gets enough traction to force a delay. And the comm log has been tampered with. Partially. Enough to challenge the transmission record." Emily kept her voice even. "Your recording would corroborate what I heard. Independent device, direct capture, clean timestamp. 2 separate records of the same transmission are significantly harder to dismiss than one." Donna looked at her coffee. "I have it," she said. "I've had it since that night. I put it on an encrypted drive, and I put the drive in a box, and I put the box in a place I don't look at." She paused. "I've thought about this for 6 years. What I'd do if someone came asking." She looked up. "I always thought it would be someone I didn't want to open the door to." "Is it?" Emily said. Donna looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through her face that wasn't a simple thing. "No," she said finally. "But I need you to understand what this costs. I have a job I've built from nothing. I have a partner who doesn't know any of this. I have a life that it's mine. I built it specifically to not be what the Army left me with." Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was working. "If I produce that recording, I become part of this, publicly." "Probably," Emily said. "I'm not going to tell you otherwise." "Will it matter? Is it actually going to change something?" "I don't know," Emily said. "I know that without it, the case against Holt has a gap big enough that his attorneys can work with it. With it," she paused. "With it, there are 2 independent recordings of a classified transmission that contradicts the official operational record, corroborated by a formal eyewitness statement, a suppressed supplemental report, a manipulated comm log, and a cooperative witness inside the original command structure." She held Donna's gaze. "That doesn't guarantee anything, but it's the difference between a case that can be managed and a case that can't." Donna was quiet. "He ordered Daniel Vane left behind," Emily said. "Not as a manipulation, just as the fact that it was. He did it for reasons that had nothing to do with operational necessity. And then he spent 6 years building toward a position that would make him untouchable." She paused. "You don't have to do this. That's real. But if you don't, and he gets confirmed, the people who could have stopped it will know they had the chance." Donna put her mug down. She sat back in her chair. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way people look at things that aren't there when they're making a decision that has real weight. "Give me 20 minutes, she said. The encrypted drive was in a fireproof box in a storage unit 6 blocks away, because Donna Rafe had spent 6 years making sure that if anyone ever came for it, they would not be able to get there ahead of her. She drove herself. She was back in 23 minutes. She plugged the drive into her laptop at the kitchen table with Vane and Orban now in the room. They'd come in when Emily signaled from the doorway, and Donna had looked at Vane for a long moment and said nothing and had not asked him to leave. And she found the file, and she played it. The quality was different from Emily's recording, cleaner. The ambient noise was there, the debris, the wind, the distant sounds of a situation coming apart at its edges. But the voice came through with the clarity of a direct signal capture, which it was. Garrison Holt's voice, in the specific flat cadence of someone giving operational orders, setting extraction parameters that did not match the mission plan, naming the sequence in which lives were prioritized in language so careful and procedural that the cruelty of it was almost invisible. Almost. Vane listened to the whole thing with his hands flat on the table and his face doing nothing. When it ended, he sat very still for 4 seconds. Then he said, "That's enough." Orban was already on the phone. What happened next was not cinematic in the way people imagine justice being when they imagine it. It was paperwork and phone calls and a JAG officer arriving at Donna Rafe's kitchen at 2:40 in the morning with 2 colleagues and recording equipment, and the careful, methodical work of adding something to an evidentiary record in a way that couldn't be unwound. It was Donna signing forms and answering questions in the flat, precise language she used when she was keeping her feelings in a separate room and would deal with them later. It was Vane stepping outside twice and coming back with his jaw set and his eyes clearer than they'd been in a way Emily noticed but didn't comment on. It was not clean. It was not smooth. There were moments where the bureaucratic machinery of it was genuinely aggravating. A form that needed a specific authorization code, a secure transmission that required 3 attempts before it connected, a question from one of the JAG officers that made Emily have to work hard at keeping her voice patient. Real things were like that. They had friction. They had the texture of actual processes run by actual people under actual pressure at 3 in the morning when everyone involved would rather be somewhere else. At 4:12, Major Solis called Orban's phone. Emily watched his face while he listened. "Understood," he said. "Yes, that's correct." A pause. "She's here." He held the phone toward Emily. "She wants to speak with you." Emily took it. "Major?" "Miss Carr." Solis's voice was precise and unhurried even at this hour. "The second recording has been added to the formal record. Combined with your statement, the supplemental report, the comm-log analysis, and Sergeant Wade's formal cooperation, the JAG Investigation Office has filed a request to the Senate Oversight Committee for a mandatory hold on the confirmation proceeding pending full investigation review." A pause. "The request went in 40 minutes ago. Committee protocol requires acknowledgement within 12 hours. Will they comply?" 2 members of the committee have already attempted to block the notification. That attempt has been documented and referred to the committee chair, who is not in Holt's network and is currently, Solis paused, currently very unhappy about the midnight communication from Holt's office and is making that unhappiness known through the appropriate channels. A beat. "I won't tell you the hold is guaranteed. What I can tell you is that the investigation record is now airtight enough that anyone who moves against it does so visibly." Emily stood in Donna Rafe's front hallway and held that for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "Do not thank me. File what you know when you know it." Solis said it without heat, just as a principle. "That's all any of us can do." The call ended. Emily stood there for a moment with the phone in her hand and the particular silence of a house at 4 in the morning around her, and she thought about Daniel Vane sitting in the dark, tying a cord around a dog's harness, and she thought about 6 years of carrying this. And she thought about the specific weight of something that has been a burden for so long you've stopped noticing it's there, right up until the moment it isn't. It wasn't over. She knew that. Holt had lawyers and relationships and the accumulated momentum of 6 years of careful positioning. The investigation would take months. There would be attempts to discredit her, to discredit Donna, to frame this as personal rather than factual. There would be hard days and setbacks, and the specific grinding endurance required to stay in the truth of something when powerful people were actively working to make that truth look like something else. But the record existed now. It was filed, time-stamped, legally protected, multi-sourced, and in the hands of people whose job was specifically to not let it disappear. That was different from where they'd been 12 hours ago. That was real. She drove back to the hospital in Orban's car as the sky was shifting from black to the dark blue that came before dawn. Vane rode in the back again. Donna had stayed at her house with a JAG officer and her own particular version of what the rest of the night was going to cost her, which was not Emily's to manage and which Emily trusted her to handle in the way she'd handled everything else, imperfectly and with the specific resilience of someone who had already come through the worst version of things once. At some point on the drive, Vane said, "She didn't have to do that." "No," Emily agreed. "Neither did you. 6 years ago, you didn't have to go back." She looked at the dark highway. "Yes, I did." "Protocol said—" "I know what protocol said." She paused. "I didn't go back because of protocol. I went back because he was there and I knew, and leaving with that felt like a thing I wouldn't be able to live next to." She paused again. "I didn't save him. I was too late. That's the part that doesn't have a resolution." She kept her eyes on the road outside the window. "Some things don't." Vane was quiet. "I've spent 6 years thinking the not saving was the failure," she said. "It wasn't. The failure was that the situation existed at all, and the failure belongs to the person who created it." She looked at her reflection briefly in the window glass. "I had to figure that out by myself, which took longer than it should have. But I got there." Vane made a sound that wasn't quite a word. She understood it. "He was proud of you," she said. "Whatever happened between you two, whatever the distance was, he talked about you. That night, before the end, he was clear about who he wanted to make sure knew what happened. She held the steadiness in her voice by will. He picked you specifically. That's not nothing. From the back seat, in the dark, she heard Vane breathe in the way people breathe when they are containing something large in a small space. She didn't look back. She gave him the dark and the silence and the moving road, which was the only dignified thing she had to offer, and she thought it was probably enough. She retrieved her car from the hospital parking structure at 5:30 and sat in it for 6 minutes without starting it, which was all she allowed herself before she turned the key and drove home. She slept 4 hours. She was back on shift by 10. The confirmation hold was officially acknowledged by the committee chair at 11:47 that morning, which she found out from a news alert on her phone during a medication round. She read it twice, put her phone in her pocket, finished the round, and went to check on Mrs. Ferraro, who had finally, with significant medication adjustment and patient staff management, stopped pulling her own IV. Small victories were still victories. 3 days later, Brennan Wade was formally transferred to military custody, and the cooperation agreement with JAG was entered into the official record. His statement named Garrison Holt directly and specifically, corroborating both recordings with operational detail that only someone inside the command structure could have provided. It named the decision, the rationale, and the subsequent cover, the equipment failure notation, the record maintenance update, the management of Emily's supplemental report through channels designed to ensure it was received and not acted on. The story broke publicly on the 4th day through a reporter at a national outlet who had been working a related thread on military command accountability for 8 months, and who received a tip from someone Emily never identified and didn't try to. The reporting was careful and specific and cited the JAG investigation without compromising it, and it named Garrison Holt in the headline of a story that was shared widely enough that by evening it had moved beyond the news cycle that could be managed and into the kind of public record that persisted regardless of what happened next. Holt's attorney released 2 more statements in the following week. The first characterized the investigation as politically motivated. The second, released 4 days after the first, was notably shorter and included language about cooperating fully with oversight processes, which was the specific phrasing people used when they had been told by their legal representation that the situation had changed significantly. The confirmation hearing was formally postponed indefinitely on a Wednesday. Emily found out from her phone during lunch. She ate the rest of her sandwich. 6 weeks after that, on a gray November morning, she drove to Fort Aldrin for a formal evaluation that she'd been told would take approximately an hour, and which took closer to 3, because the process of officially correcting a military service record, adding a supplemental, noting an unauthorized action alongside its context and intent, amending the characterization of a separation, was not a simple process, and the people doing it were being thorough, which she appreciated even when it was slow. Major Solis handled the bulk of it personally. She was the same as she'd been in the hospital consultation room, small, precise, unhurried, with the specific quality of someone for whom doing things correctly was not a performance but a practice. She walked Emily through each amendment. She explained what each change meant in terms of the official record and what it didn't mean. She was clear that the unauthorized return to Blackstone Ridge remained what it was, a direct violation of separation orders, and that the amended record reflected that alongside the intent and the context. "It's not an erasure," Solis said. "The record shows what happened. All of it." "I know," Emily said. "That's fine. I'd rather have an honest record than a clean one." Solis looked at her for a moment. Then she wrote something that Emily couldn't see and moved to the next page. At the end of the process, Solis handed her a formal document, the amended service record summary, signed and witnessed, and shook her hand again with the same direct grip as before. "For what it's worth," Solis said, and then stopped, which was unusual for her. She started again. "It took courage to keep that evidence for 6 years, without knowing if it would ever matter." Emily looked at this document in her hands. "It mattered to me," she said. "That was enough to keep going." Solis nodded once. Then she was on to the next thing, which was correct. Rook came home, if home was the right word, and Emily had decided it was close enough. On a Tuesday in December, 3 months and 1 week after the surgery that had extracted the fragment and left him with a clean shoulder and a new titanium plate, and a recovery timeline that Dr. Morrow had managed with the same meticulous care she brought to everything. The retirement evaluation was held at a Fort Aldrin facility in a room that smelled of linoleum and institutional coffee, with several handlers present and the standard assessment protocol that military working dog retirements went through. Emily was there because Dr. Morrow had asked her to be, not officially, but with the particular directness of someone who thought it mattered and wasn't going to make a speech about why. Vane was there too. He was in civilian clothes again. He looked better than he had in October. Not healed, because that wasn't the right word for what happened to grief over time, but differently weighted. Like he'd put something down and found that he could still walk. The evaluation was straightforward. Rook was assessed as medically unfit for active duty deployment due to the surgical intervention and the long-term structural changes to the joint. The assessment noted excellent temperament, complete behavioral stability, and full response to trained commands. It was the kind of evaluation that said, in the careful language of official documents, that this animal had given everything and was now owed something quieter. The handler placement portion was less formal. Rook was brought into the room on a lead by DeLuca, who had been working with him through the recovery and who had clearly developed the particular attachment that happened between people and dogs who spent a lot of time together in difficult circumstances. DeLuca looked at him once with an expression that was working not to be what it was, and then looked away. Rook walked into the room and did what dogs did in rooms full of familiar people. He moved through the group, checking in, reading the air. He stopped at Vane for a moment. Vane crouched down and put a hand on his neck, and whatever passed between them in that 30 seconds was not something Emily tried to name or witness directly. She looked at the wall. Then Rook came to her. He pressed against her left leg the way he'd done in the hospital corridor that first morning, and stood there with his weight against her and his breathing slow and even. She reached down and put her hand on the side of his neck. She had the red paracord in her jacket pocket. She'd retrieved it from Dr. Morrow after the surgery. It had been removed before the procedure and kept in a labeled bag, which Emily had found both clinically appropriate and privately very moving. She'd carried it since without being entirely sure what she was waiting for. She knew now. She took it out. She tied it to his new collar, not the working harness, which was being retired with him, but the plain nylon collar he'd been wearing through recovery. She tied it the same way she'd tied it 6 years ago, twice around the clip, with the fraying end tucked under. "Lantern out," she said quietly. "Come home." Rook leaned into her. She looked up and found Vane watching. His face was doing the complicated thing again, the thing she'd stopped trying to name, and she held his gaze for a moment and then looked back down at the dog. "Okay," she said, to Rook, to herself, to the room. "Okay." The investigation into Garrison Holt concluded formally in the spring, 8 months after that October night at Harwick Regional. The findings were released through the Oversight Committee and reported extensively enough that the shape of what he'd done became part of the public record in the way that made it permanent. Not because justice was always permanent, but because enough people had seen it clearly enough that making it disappear would have required erasing too many things at once. He was formally charged on 4 counts, including abuse of command authority, falsification of operational records, and obstruction of a military investigation. The cooperation of Brennan Wade, whose testimony was the most operationally specific piece of the case, was noted in the proceedings as a material factor in the outcome. Wade received a reduced charge in exchange, not immunity, as he'd been told from the beginning, but the formal acknowledgement of cooperation that affected the calculus. He was separated from military service without honor. It was not nothing. It was also not everything. Justice rarely was. Holt's formal hearing took 3 days. He did not testify. His attorneys entered a statement on his behalf that was 14 pages long and contained no admission of anything. The committee chair read the findings into the record with the specific, measured delivery of someone who understood that what they were saying would exist in that form for longer than anyone currently in the room would be alive. Guilty on 3 counts. The 4th was reduced. He would not serve in any federal capacity. His portrait at Fort Aldrin was taken down on a Thursday with no ceremony, which was the right way to do it. She drove back to the hospital in Orban's car as the sky was shifting from black to the dark blue that came before dawn. Vane rode in the back again. Donna had stayed at her house with a JAG officer and her own particular version of what the rest of the night was going to cost her, which was not Emily's to manage, and which Emily trusted her to handle in the way she'd handled everything else. imperfectly and with the specific resilience of someone who had already come through the worst version of things once. At some point on the drive, Vane said, "She didn't have to do that." "No," Emily agreed. "Neither did you. 6 years ago, you didn't have to go back." She looked at the dark highway. "Yes, I did." Protocol said, "I know what protocol said." She paused. "I didn't go back because of protocol. I went back because he was there and I knew, and leaving with that felt like a thing I wouldn't be able to live next to." She paused again. "I didn't save him. I was too late. That's the part that doesn't have a resolution." She kept her eyes on the road outside the window. "Some things don't." Vane was quiet. "I've spent 6 years thinking the not saving was the failure," she said. "It wasn't. The failure was that the situation existed at all. And the failure belongs to the person who created it." She looked at her reflection briefly in the window glass. "I had to figure that out by myself, which took longer than it should have. But I got there." Vane made a sound that wasn't quite a word. She understood it. "He was proud of you," she said. "Whatever happened between you two, whatever the distance was, he talked about you. That night, before the end. He was clear about who he wanted to make sure knew what happened." She held the steadiness in her voice by will. "He picked you specifically. That's not nothing." From the back seat, in the dark, she heard Vane breathe in the way people breathe when they are containing something large in a small space. She didn't look back. She gave him the dark and the silence and the moving road, which was the only dignified thing she had to offer, and she thought it was probably enough. She retrieved her car from the hospital parking structure at 5:30 and sat in it for 6 minutes without starting it, which was all she allowed herself before she turned the key and drove home. She slept 4 hours. She was back on shift by 10. The confirmation hold was officially acknowledged by the committee chair at 11:47 that morning, which she found out from a news alert on her phone during a medication round. She read it twice, put her phone in her pocket, finished the round, and went to check on Mrs. Ferraro, who had finally, with significant medication adjustment and patient staff management, stopped pulling her own IV. Small victories were still victories. 3 days later, Brennan Wade was formally transferred to military custody, and the cooperation agreement with JAIG was entered into the official record. His statement named Garrison Holt directly and specifically, corroborating both recordings with operational detail that only someone inside the command structure could have provided. It named the decision, the rationale, and the subsequent cover, the equipment failure notation, the record maintenance update, the management of Emily's supplemental report through channels designed to ensure it was received and not acted on. The story broke publicly on the 4th day, through a reporter at a national outlet who had been working a related thread on military command accountability for 8 months, and who received a tip from someone Emily never identified and didn't try to. The reporting was careful and specific and cited the JAG investigation without compromising it, and it named Garrison Holt in the headline of a story that was shared widely enough that by evening it had moved beyond the news cycle that could be managed and into the kind of public record that persisted regardless of what happened next. Holt's attorney released 2 more statements in the following week. The first characterized the investigation as politically motivated. The second, released 4 days after the first, was notably shorter and included language about cooperating fully with oversight processes, which was the specific phrasing people used when they had been told by their legal representation that the situation had changed significantly. The confirmation hearing was formally postponed indefinitely on a Wednesday. Emily found out from her phone during lunch. She ate the rest of her sandwich. 6 weeks after that, on a gray November morning, she drove to Fort Aldrin for a formal evaluation that she'd been told would take approximately an hour and which took closer to 3, because the process of officially correcting a military service record, adding a supplemental, noting an unauthorized action alongside its context and intent, amending the characterization of a separation, was not a simple process, and the people doing it were being thorough, which she appreciated even when it was slow. Major Solis handled the bulk of it personally. She was the same as she'd been in the hospital consultation room, small, precise, unhurried, with the specific quality of someone for whom doing things correctly was not a performance but a practice. She walked Emily through each amendment. She explained what each change meant in terms of the official record and what it didn't mean. She was clear that the unauthorized return to Blackstone Ridge remained what it was, a direct violation of separation orders, and that the amended record reflected that alongside the intent and the context. "It's not an erasure," Solis said. "The record shows what happened. All of it." "I know," Emily said. "That's fine. I'd rather have an honest record than a clean one." Solis looked at her for a moment. Then she wrote something that Emily couldn't see and moved to the next page. At the end of the process, Solis handed her a formal document, the amended service record summary, signed and witnessed, and shook her hand again with the same direct grip as before. "For what it's worth," Solis said, and then stopped, which was unusual for her. She started again. "It took courage to keep that evidence, for 6 years, without knowing if it would ever matter." Emily looked at the document in her hands. "It mattered to me," she said. "That was enough to keep going." Solis nodded once. Then she was on to the next thing, which was correct. Rook came home, if home was the right word, and Emily had decided it was close enough, on a Tuesday in December, 3 months and 1 week after the surgery that had extracted the fragment and left him with a clean shoulder and a new titanium plate and a recovery timeline that Dr. Morrow had managed with the same meticulous care she brought to everything. The retirement evaluation was held at a Fort Aldrin facility in a room that smelled of linoleum and institutional coffee, with several handlers present and the standard assessment protocol that military working dog retirements went through. Emily was there because Dr. Morrow had asked her to be, not officially, but with the particular directness of someone who thought it mattered and wasn't going to make a speech about why. Vane was there too. He was in civilian clothes again. He looked better than he had in October, not healed, because that wasn't the right word for what happened to grief over time, but differently weighted. Like he'd put something down and found that he could still walk. The evaluation was straightforward. Rook was assessed as medically unfit for active duty deployment due to the surgical intervention and the long-term structural changes to the joint. The assessment noted excellent temperament, complete behavioral stability, and full response to trained commands. It was the kind of evaluation that said, in the careful language of official documents, that this animal had given everything and was now owed something quieter. The handler placement portion was less formal. Rook was brought into the room on a lead by DeLuca, who had been working with him through the recovery and who had clearly developed the particular attachment that happened between people and dogs who spent a lot of time together in difficult circumstances. DeLuca looked at him once with an expression that was working not to be what it was, and then looked away. Rook walked into the room and did what dogs did in rooms full of familiar people. He moved through the group, checking in, reading the air. He stopped at Vane for a moment. Vane crouched down and put a hand on his neck, and whatever passed between them in that 30 seconds was not something Emily tried to name or witness directly. She looked at the wall. Then Rook came to her. He pressed against her left leg the way he'd done in the hospital corridor that first morning, and stood there with his weight against her and his breathing slow and even. She reached down and put her hand on the side of his neck. She had the red paracord in her jacket pocket. She'd retrieved it from Dr. Morrow after the surgery. It had been removed before the procedure and kept in a labeled bag, which Emily had found both clinically appropriate and privately very moving. She'd carried it since without being entirely sure what she was waiting for. She knew now. She took it out. She tied it to his new collar, not the working harness, which was being retired with him, but the plain nylon collar he'd been wearing through recovery. She tied it the same way she'd tied it 6 years ago, twice around the clip, with the fraying end tucked under. "Lantern out," she said quietly. "Come home." Rook leaned into her. She looked up and found Vane watching. His face was doing the complicated thing again, the thing she'd stopped trying to name, and she held his gaze for a moment and then looked back down at the dog. "Okay," she said. To Rook, to herself, to the room. "Okay." The investigation into Garrison Holt concluded formally in the spring, 8 months after that October night at Harwick Regional. The findings were released through the Oversight Committee and reported extensively enough that the shape-out of what he'd done became part of the public record in the way that made it permanent. Not because justice was always permanent, but because enough people had seen it clearly enough that making it disappear would have required erasing too many things at once. He was formally charged on 4 counts, including abuse of command authority, falsification of operational records, and obstruction of a military investigation. The cooperation of Brennan Wade, whose testimony was the most operationally specific piece of the case, was noted in the proceedings as a material factor in the outcome. Wade received a reduced charge in exchange, not immunity, as he'd been told from the beginning, but the formal acknowledgement of cooperation that affected the calculus. He was separated from military service without honor. It was not nothing. It was also not everything. Justice rarely was. Holt's formal hearing took 3 days. He did not testify. His attorneys entered a statement on his behalf that was 14 pages long and contained no admission of anything. The committee chair read the findings into the record with the specific, measured delivery of someone who understood that what they were saying would exist in that form for longer than anyone currently in the room would be alive. Guilty on 3 counts. The 4th was reduced. He would not serve in any federal capacity. His portrait at Fort Aldrin was taken down on a Thursday with no ceremony, which was the right way to do it. Emily read the verdict summary during a break between patients. She put her phone away, washed her hands, and went back to work. She was the charge nurse in a hospital that still had a Mrs. Ferraro situation approximately once a week, and that work did not stop for verdicts. But she was something else now too, and she knew it. Not in the way of someone who had been transformed into something different, but in the way of someone who had always been exactly who they were and had finally gotten to stand in the full light of that, without the weight of an untold truth making everything slightly smaller than it was. She had been underestimated in this building for 4 years. She had been the nurse who was slightly too still, who scanned rooms, who had a scar she didn't explain. She had carried a classified truth through those 4 years like something folded tight inside her chest, and people had looked at her and seen competence, if they were paying attention, and not much else. She didn't need them to see more now. That wasn't what had changed. What had changed was that she knew, in a way she hadn't fully known before, that the things she carried were not weight. They were evidence of who she was and what she'd done and what she'd refused to let die quietly in the dark of an untended archive. Donna Rafe sent her a text 3 days after the verdict. It said, "Still standing. You?" Emily typed back, "Yeah, still standing." She meant it. What? On a Sunday morning in March, on the coast 20 miles from Claremont, Rook ran across a stretch of beach with the slightly lopsided gait that the titanium plate had left him with, and that Dr. Morrow said would likely be permanent. He didn't seem to mind. He ran the way dogs ran when they had access to open space and cold air and a person throwing a length of rope toy, with a completeness of self that humans spent entire lifetimes trying to approximate. Emily threw the toy again and watched him go. Vane stood beside her with his hands in his jacket pockets. He'd driven up from Fort Aldrin, where he was finishing out the year before a transition he'd described to her on the phone 2 weeks ago in the specific, careful language of someone who has decided something significant and is still getting used to the shape of it. He was stepping back from field command. Not out entirely, but into something different. A training and advisory role that had less operational authority and more of the kind of work that didn't involve being the most capable person in every room at the cost of everything else. He'd said it like he expected her to have an opinion about it. She'd said it sounded right. He'd been quiet for a moment and then said she was probably the only person he'd told who hadn't immediately listed the things he'd be giving up. She hadn't thought there was anything useful in that list. Now he was standing on a beach watching a retired military working dog run sideways into the surf, and his face had the specific quality of someone who was, imperfectly and incompletely, and with full awareness of everything it had cost to get here. Okay. Not fine. Not healed. Not transformed into a better version of himself through the alchemy of grief and justice. Just okay, which was the real thing, the sustainable thing, the thing that actually held weight when you put it on it. "He's going to be completely sandy," Vane said. "Yes." "Your car, right?" "Yes." He almost smiled. Rook came back with the rope toy and dropped it at Emily's feet and looked at her with the complete, uncomplicated expectation of someone who knew exactly what they wanted and had no doubt whatsoever about asking for it. She picked up the toy and threw it again. He ran. The red cord on his collar caught the light. She watched him go. She thought about the things that had happened and the things that still needed to happen, and the fact that there would always be more of both, that justice was not a destination, but a direction. That doing the right thing when it was hard and expensive and uncertain was not heroism in the cinematic sense, but something more ordinary and more durable. Just the decision, made again and again, to not let the truth die quietly, because it was inconvenient to keep it alive. She thought about Daniel Vane, who had made that decision in the dark, in the final minutes of his life, with a dog pressed against his side and a piece of red cord in his hands. She thought about what it meant to carry something for someone who couldn't carry it anymore. She thought it meant doing exactly this: being still standing, being on a beach in March, being the kind of person who showed up, who kept the evidence, who knocked on the door at 1 a.m, who said the 2 words that brought the dog home. It was not a small thing to be that person. It never had been. Rook came back. She threw the toy. The ocean was cold and gray and completely indifferent to all of it, which was correct. The world did not organize itself around individual acts of courage or individual acts of cruelty. It just kept moving, and what you did inside that movement was the only thing you ever actually controlled. She had done something inside that movement. It had mattered. That was enough. It had always been enough. She just finally had the paperwork to prove it. The wind came off the water, and she turned her face into it, and Rook ran, and the morning held them all in the unceremonious, imperfect, completely adequate way that mornings did. Without fanfare, without resolution, without anything more than the next moment arriving exactly as it was. She was ready for it.